The story takes place some years after former boxing champion George "Iceman" Chambers' famous fight with Monroe Hutchin, and now George Chambers is no longer the world champion and is living a very rough and difficult life. He is currently in Russia, where he works on filming a commercial, and he clearly hates every moment of it because he has to speak Russian language that he does not understand properly. He feels embarrassed and frustrated, but his manager Phil Gold reminds him again and again that he has no real choice anymore because he is no longer at the top of the boxing world and he desperately needs money to survive. George Chambers argues with his manager, but Phil Gold stays firm and tells him that this is what life looks like after losing the championship, so George Chambers finishes the shoot with clear anger and exhaustion on his face. At the same time, far away from the film set, inside at Chornya Cholmny prison in Russia, a brutal underground fight is about to begin soon. The prison has its own illegal fighting program, and the fights are secretly broadcast to a crowded club owned by a man named Gaga, the most powerful Russian mafia boss. Inside the club, people drink, shout, and place heavy bets on the fighters, while the atmosphere feels tense and dangerous. The commentator introduces the first fighter, Arkady Davich, who is serving time for second-degree homicide and has 14 wins in prison fights. Then the commentator introduces Yuri Boyka, a psychopathic Russian gang leader highly trained in martial arts. The fight starts under very loose rules, and both fighters attack each other without mercy. While this violent fight continues, George Chambers finally reaches his hotel after the exhausting shoot. Phil Gold is already waiting for him and is furious because George Chambers arrives late for an important dinner with the commercial executives. Phil Gold complains loudly, but George Chambers does not care and coldly tells him that he will join them after changing his clothes. George Chambers goes to his room, but the moment he enters, he finds two criminals inside, planting cocaine among his belongings. But suddenly a third man appears from behind and hits George Chambers hard, knocking him unconscious. The bettors collect their money, and Gaga's assistant nervously comments that if they do not find someone who can defeat Yuri Boyka soon, the club will lose its attraction and be forced to shut down. At the hotel, manager Phil Gold finds George Chambers unconscious in his room just as hotel security arrives. The drugs are discovered, and Phil Gold angrily points out that no one saw anyone enter or leave the area, which makes the situation even more suspicious. Despite this, George Chambers is arrested for possession of narcotics. Meanwhile, back in the prison, Yuri Boyka sits calmly while another inmate named Carol cuts the tape from his wrists after the fight. Carol accidentally nicks Yuri Boyka's skin with the scissors, and instead of accepting the apology, Yuri Boyka becomes enraged. He grabs Kirill's hand and prepares to cut it off as punishment. Before he can do it, another man interrupts and tells Yuri Boyka that George Chambers is already in trouble with the police and will be arriving at the prison by tomorrow. Hearing this, Yuri Boyka shows no mercy and brutally cuts Kirill's hand anyway. George Chambers is soon transferred to Chornya Cholmny prison in Russia to await his charges. As he arrives, the prisoners gather around, curious to see the famous former champion, and Yuri Boyka watches him closely with cold anger in his eyes. George Chambers is taken to meet the prison warden Marvok, who explains that the prison has its own fighting championship and suggests that George Chambers should participate. George Chambers refuses, believing that he will be released soon because he has been framed. Afterward, George Chambers is given prison clothes and taken to the shower room, where he demands hot water. When the guards refuse, George Chambers beats up 3 of them without hesitation. The head guard calls for backup, and George Chambers is quickly overpowered and forced to take an ice-cold shower before being thrown into his cell. The next morning, George Chambers' cellmate named Stephen Parker, who is a British junkie, wakes him up and tells him that if he stays inside the cell, the guards will lock him in all day. During lunchtime, the entire prison mess hall stands up when Yuri Boyka enters, showing respect and fear, but George Chambers remains seated and refuses to do the same. One of Yuri Boyka's men approaches George Chambers and orders him to stand, but George Chambers responds by punching him. George Chambers then walks straight to Yuri Boyka, spits into his cup, and openly disrespects him. When Yuri Boyka claims to be the prison champion, George Chambers throws water in his face. A fight breaks out immediately, but the guards rush in and separate them. Yuri Boyka is furious that the guards stopped the fight, but the warden Marvok promises him that he will get his chance to face George Chambers in the ring. Later, manager Phil Gold visits George Chambers and tells him that his bail could take up to a month. George Chambers becomes furious because he knows he has been framed and now must survive in one of the most dangerous prisons in the world. At the same time, Gaga visits Warden Marvok and hands him a large amount of money to arrange a fight between Yuri Boyka and George Chambers. As days pass, George Chambers notices his cellmate, Stephen Parker, being bullied by other inmates, so he steps in and easily defeats them. Stephen Parker thanks George Chambers and warns him that the entire prison is controlled by Gaga, and he advises George Chambers that the only way to survive is to fight in the program. Soon, Yuri Boyka understands that George Chambers has beaten his men and has no fear of him, so he openly confronts George Chambers in front of everyone and challenges him to fight in the ring to prove who truly rules the prison. George Chambers looks at Yuri Boyka with calm confidence and refuses to wait for an official match, saying that if Yuri Boyka wants to fight, they can do it right there without rules or permission. The tension spreads quickly, but before either of them can move, the guards rush in and forcefully separate them, dragging George Chambers away, while Yuri Boyka shouts in anger and promises that George Chambers will not escape him. Later, Kirill tapes Yuri Boyka's arms before another prison fight, and while working nervously, he quietly advises Yuri Boyka to forget about George Chambers for a while and focus on defending his title, because George Chambers is bringing unnecessary trouble. Yuri Boyka responds with sudden violence, slapping Kirill across the face and telling him to stop talking and do his job properly, making it clear that George Chambers is now the only thing on his mind. That night, the illegal club fills with noise and excitement, and every single bet is placed on Yuri Boyka, because no one believes anyone else can defeat him. This situation angers Gaga, because when the outcome feels certain, the thrill dies. So he angrily calls the warden Marvok and orders him to make sure that the next big fight happens between Yuri Boyka and George Chambers, no matter the cost. Another fight begins inside the prison ring. After winning, Yuri Boyka slowly turns and points straight at George Chambers, silently calling him into the ring, and everyone understands that this fight is coming. Later, when George Chambers sits quietly in his cell, the head guard arrives and orders him to meet the warden Marvok immediately. George Chambers refuses and remarks that he has nothing to discuss with him, and when the guard tries to force him, George Chambers attacks him. The head guard quickly calls for backup, and several guards rush in, who overpower George Chambers, tie his hands, and beat him badly. The warden Marvok then arrives and calmly tells George Chambers that he can get an early release if he agrees to fight Yuri Boyka in the ring. George Chambers refuses again, saying he will not fight under pressure, and this angers the warden Marvok, who punishes him by assigning him humiliating physical labor in the prison sewer system. Every day, George Chambers works deep inside the dark and freezing sewer tunnels, shoveling filth until his body aches, and after finishing his work, he must return his shovel to a wheelchaired man known as Krot, who is an ex-soldier. When George Chambers returns to his cell one evening, Stephen Parker explains that Krot was once a powerful commander in the Russian army and even killed a prison guard in the past, which is why he will never be released and is forced to spend the rest of his life inside the prison. Later that night, while Stephen Parker cleans the hallway, he notices an opportunity to take drugs that a cafeteria worker secretly smuggles inside. As he reaches for them, Yuri Boyka's men catch him. They shove pills into his hand, and one of them steps hard on Stephen Parker's fingers, crushing them painfully, while threatening him and ordering him to make sure that George Chambers agrees to fight Yuri Boyka. Stephen Parker is terrified and helpless, knowing he has no way out. The next morning, when George Chambers goes down to the sewer for work, Yuri Boyka's men surround him and attack all at once. George Chambers fights back with everything he has, but he is badly outnumbered, and they are close to seriously injuring him. At that moment, Krot appears and distracts them, and as the men turn their attention toward him, George Chambers finds an opening and strikes back hard. Krot even attacks Yuri Boyka's men himself, showing surprising strength despite his condition. Soon, the guards arrive and stop the fight, but instead of helping George Chambers, they punish him by locking him inside a metal cage in the freezing sewer, where he shivers for hours in the cold and darkness. Later, Krot secretly brings him food and medicine and tells him the harsh truth that it does not matter whether he was framed or innocent, because the prison will never let him leave unless he agrees to fight. Eventually, the warden Marvok releases George Chambers and leads him into a private room, where Gaga waits with armed men, clearly showing that George Chambers will be shot if he makes one wrong move. Gaga calmly explains that he is the one who put George Chambers in prison and that he also has the power to get him out, but only if George Chambers fights Yuri Boyka. George Chambers refuses again, saying that his manager Phil Gold will take care of everything. Gaga then orders Phil Gold to enter the room, revealing that Phil Gold is part of the entire setup. Phil Gold tells George Chambers to stop being stubborn and accept reality. George Chambers becomes furious and feels completely betrayed, but seeing no escape, he reluctantly agrees to fight. Training begins immediately, and while George Chambers relies mainly on his boxing skills, Yuri Boyka prepares deadly kicks, throws, and ground attacks.
We have one more job for you.
George! Iceman! Chamber! Yuri! Boyka!
No biting?
Come on, Stevie.
The next morning, Krot tells George Chambers that he was drugged during the last fight. Hearing this, George Chambers becomes furious and limps through the prison and confronts Yuri Boyka in the mess hall, accusing him of cheating, but Yuri Boyka denies it honestly, unaware of his men's actions. When George Chambers demands his release, the warden Marvok denies any deal, and George Chambers punches him in anger. As punishment, the warden Marvok chains George Chambers to a pole in the freezing prison yard and orders the guards to beat him. Later, Yuri Boyka learns the truth and kills 2 of his own men for drugging George Chambers, while Phil Gold takes his money from Gaga and prepares to leave for America, only to be shot dead by Gaga's enforcer, sealing George Chambers' fate even further. Back inside the prison yard, George Chambers stands chained in the freezing cold, and his body shakes badly as the wind cuts through him. So when other inmates see his condition, they quietly step forward and give him pieces of clothing and some food to help him survive the night. The warden Marvok notices this act of unity and kindness, and instead of stopping it gently, he becomes angry and orders every inmate who helped George Chambers to stand outside with him in the harsh cold as punishment. The next morning, George Chambers is taken back to his cell on Gaga's direct orders, and when Gaga arrives, he scolds the warden Marvok harshly for treating George Chambers so cruelly, reminding him that George Chambers is important to his plans. Gaga then turns to George Chambers and calmly tells him that if he defeats Yuri Boyka in the next fight, he will finally be set free. George Chambers listens carefully and agrees, but he makes one clear condition, saying that there must be no drugs involved this time because he wants a fair fight. Gaga nods and asks if George Chambers has any other demands, and George Chambers surprises him by asking for warm clothes for all the prisoners. Gaga agrees, and later that day, George Chambers watches quietly as prisoners receive jackets, and for the first time in a long while, the prison feels a little less cold. After this, George Chambers returns to training, and while he works on his strength and movement, Krot visits him and tells him honestly that boxing alone will not be enough to defeat Yuri Boyka, because Yuri Boyka is dangerous in every range of combat. Krot explains that he knows military close combat techniques that could save George Chambers' life in the ring. At first, George Chambers refuses, saying that prison fights are like street fights and that he knows how to survive them. But after thinking about Yuri Boyka's strength and brutality, he realizes that pride will only get him killed. He finally accepts Krot's help, and they begin training together, with Krot teaching him how to attack joints, control balance, and even break an arm if necessary. Later that night, George Chambers walks into Krot's area and sees him looking at an old photograph while softly playing a small instrument. Krot quickly hides the picture when he notices George Chambers, and George Chambers apologizes for interrupting and turns to leave. However, Krot stops him and decides to share his past. He explains that when he was serving in the army, his younger brother committed a robbery, and because his brother had a bright future and a family to protect, Krot chose to take the blame. He receives only 4 years in prison, but the prison life breaks him mentally and physically. During his sentence, he attempts to escape, and in the chaos, a guard is killed, and Krot is left paralyzed. Because of this, he is sentenced to life in prison and placed in solitary confinement for a long time. He tells George Chambers that his real name is Nikolai and says he feels a connection to George Chambers because both of them are punished by a system that does not care about the truth. The next morning, training continues with even more intensity, and Nikolai teaches George Chambers how to attack the legs, explaining that if a fighter cannot stand, he cannot fight. George Chambers listens closely and practices every movement with focus and discipline. Finally, the day of the fight arrives. Yuri Boyka gathers his men and confidently tells them that he will prove once and for all that he is the most complete fighter in the prison by defeating George Chambers again. On the other side, Nikolai quietly advises George Chambers to leave immediately after the fight, warning him not to get pulled back into this violent world. George Chambers feels emotional, but Nikolai tells him to save his feelings and focus only on the fight ahead. George Chambers and Yuri Boyka enter the ring as the crowd roars, while Gaga and Warden Marvok sit and watch closely. Bets are placed, tension fills the air, and the fight begins.
Finish him or you will rot in this stinking hole for the rest of your life. Let you out. Do you understand?
The prison falls silent as George Chambers is declared the new undisputed champion. Gaga is extremely pleased and orders George Chambers' release, giving him a large sum of money as his share and apologizing for the harsh treatment. Gaga asks George Chambers to take a picture with him, but George Chambers refuses and remarks he will never forgive him. As George Chambers prepares to leave, he suddenly remembers something and rushes back to Warden Marvok's office. He places his money on the table and makes a deal, using his winnings to buy Nikolai's freedom. He calmly tells him that it is all right now and that he has time to let it sink in. Later, George Chambers pushes Nikolai's wheelchair to a train station where Nikolai meets his niece after many years. They embrace warmly, and as George Chambers watches them reunite, he finally feels that the pain, bruises, and fight was worth it.